On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. In the less than 3 years which have passed since his death, controversy has continually arisen about the facts and conditions of his assassination and of the arrests and deaths that took place subsequently. Ironically enough, the Warren Commission report, issued to dispel rumors and to explain the facts and circumstances of the assassination and subsequent murders, has given rise itself to a whole new set of speculations. This is Frank Millspaugh at WBAI FM, and with me in the studio today is Mr. Mark Lane, attorney, former New York State Assemblyman, and author of the recently published book, Rush to Judgment, a critique of the Warren Commission's inquiry into the murders of President John F. Kennedy, Officer J.D. Tippit, and Lee Harvey Oswald. Mr. Lane, welcome to WBAI, or welcome back, I should say more accurately.
Thank you very much.
I have just completed reading your book, and I think that maybe the title is a little modest, because it's not simply a critique, nor does it purport really to be simply a critique, but extends beyond that into some amount of independent investigation and findings, does it not?
Well, I have been to Dallas 7 times, and together with Emile D'Antonio, who directed Point of Order, the Army McCarthy documentary film, we are preparing a documentary film on the assassination, and my last 2 visits there were with Mr. D'Antonio and a production crew, at which time we interviewed on film and on tape some of the most important witnesses to the assassination and to the murder of Officer Tippit and to other peripheral events such as Ruby's entrance into the Dallas courthouse basement. And I have incorporated into the book the information given to me on film and on tape by these witnesses, yes.
One of the most recurrent themes within your book is that of material evidence which has been placed in the National Archives for a period of 75 years and therefore are not available to examination, criticism, investigation, etc., and the existence of other materials such as photographs taken at the medical examination of the president and the X-rays of the body, which have not been available to you, or for that matter, you believe have not been viewed by the commission.
Yes, in fact, when the president's body was examined by Commander Humes, who conducted the autopsy at the Bethesda Naval Hospital, he had, according to his testimony, 12 color photographs taken of the body and a whole series of X-rays. And he explained to the commission members that he required this information, which he could secure from the photographic evidence, to assist him in determining the path of the bullets as they coursed through the president's body. He then went on to say that, however, he was never able to see the photographs, which were taken ostensibly to assist him, because they were taken undeveloped, taken by the Secret Service, and he never saw them again. There is evidence that he saw some of the X-rays, because he did make reference to some of the X-rays.
And have these photographs been seen, or have they been, to your knowledge, developed?
Well, I don't know if they have been developed. I do know that they were never seen by Commander Humes, according to his own testimony. I do know that when Commander Humes appeared before the Warren Commission, he said to this presidential commission that I thought that you might not be able to get the X-rays and the photographs yourselves, and so I asked an artist if he would be good enough to do some drawings. He said, however, the artist couldn't see the photographs either, and he had to depend upon my verbal statement to him and my recollection, which is therefore inaccurate, and therefore the drawings which I am giving you are not accurate drawings. And unfortunately, his statement that the commission might not be able to see the X-rays and photographs unfortunately was borne out. The commission never did, And I don't know where they are today. I do know this, that the National Archives does not have the photographs and x-rays. I've written to the director of the National Archives, and he has so informed me. According to a recent Newsweek story, Newsweek conducted an investigation of some weeks to see if they could determine where the x-rays and photographs are, and they were unable to. The FBI said they didn't have them, the Secret Service said they didn't have them, the National Archives doesn't have them. No one seems to know where this vitally important documentary evidence is.
My understanding of it is that these x-rays and these photographs are important because they would, one would at least anticipate, show conclusively the nature of the wounds inflicted upon the president, which has been a matter of contention and conflicting testimony. And this would have serious bearing upon the Commission's conclusion that only 2 bullets were decisive in both the president's death and in the injuries of Governor Connolly.
Yes, in fact, when Congressman Gerald Ford, who was one of the members of the Commission, wrote his book called Portrait of the Assassin, he stated that at the outset, Mark Lane raised the classic question of where the shots came from. Of course, that was flattering but not accurate. Among the first to raise that question were a number of reporters in Dallas. Richard Dudman of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, in fact, said that the doctors had all said at the Parkland Hospital on television and at the press conference, the doctors who had worked on the president's body, just after they announced the president's death, every physician who was able to make an estimate as to the wound in the president's throat said the wound in the president's throat is an entrance wound. The bullet apparently entered from the front and from above and ranged downward into the chest and did not exit. Now, it would be good to be able to see the actual videotapes, but unfortunately the government, the FBI and the Secret Service have gone to Dallas and to the networks and have seized all of the existing videotape, placed them someplace, I presume in the archives, but the Commission never published a transcript. But we do know this, that Dudman, based upon that, asked the question, since it was plain that the president was looking forward and slightly to the right when the bullet struck him in the throat, and the book depository building, of course, was well behind the limousine. Dudman asked the classic question, how could Oswald shoot the president from the front, from the back? Now, to corroborate the statements of the doctors that the wound was inflicted from the front was the fact that 2/3 of the spectators in Dealey Plaza, who were able to make an assessment as to the origin of the shots, said that the shots did not come from the book depository building behind the limousine, but rather from behind a wooden fence which was on a grassy hill in front of and to the right of the limousine. Add to that the fact that 7 railroad employees, who were spectators with an excellent view of the entire scene as they stood on a railroad bridge just in front of the limousine, they all said they heard the shots, they looked toward the wooden fence because they knew the shots had come from there, and they all said independently they saw puffs of smoke come from behind the fence. You add to this the fact that 17 Dallas deputy sheriffs ran directly past the book depository building and climbed over the wooden fence and searched that area, and that was the concentration point for the search, which in 2 to 3 minutes had more than 50 police officers, some of whom, one, for example, Patrolman Smith, said he smelled gunpowder behind the wooden fence. Now, the Commission takes this overwhelming evidence, which would indicate that something took place from behind that fence, and handles it in this very simple fashion, quote, "No credible evidence suggests that the shots came from any place other than the book depository building."
Not to be macabre, but let's return to the wounds for just a moment, because it seems to me from my reading, or at least my recollection of my reading of the Commission report, that the credibility of the report as a whole is largely hinging on their analysis of the wounds. Now, one, of course, the fatal wound was the one which struck the president in the skull,
Yes.
inflicting brain damage. The other, which the Commission contends was the case, supposedly entered in the back, somewhere in the region of the neck, perhaps 6 inches below, although the Commission seems to feel at about the collar line, and exited through the throat.
Yes,
Now,
that's the Commission's story.
I understand that if there is an entrance wound and an exit wound, one must necessarily be able to run a probe from the point of entry to the point of exit.
Most doctors agree. Of course, the doctors here said that they could not in this particular case.
Could not run this probe.
Yeah. And also, regarding that wound to the President's head, which the Commission says was inflicted from the rear, standing next to the limousine, perhaps the closest spectator, was Charles Brem. Mr. Brem was an old-time old-time Ranger during World War II, and he told me that he was wounded twice in the Normandy invasion. And he said, gunfire is a funny thing. You forget all about it, but it's something like swimming. If you think you haven't been swimming for a long time, perhaps have forgotten, if you get thrown into the water, you start swimming right away. It all comes back. And he said, I heard those shots, and I was under fire again, and I knew where those shots came from. He said, when that last shot was fired, I saw the effect upon the President's head. It drove a portion of his skull, which his skull exploded as the bullet hit his head, and a portion of the President's skull was driven over the rear of the car and over the left of the car, as if the shot had come from the right front from the fence. Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman testified that he did in fact pick up the skull where Brem described it landing and delivered it to the Secret Service that day. Now, Brem was on television on November 22nd from the scene, indicating what I've just told you. In fact, in our film, we have Mr. Brem being interviewed, and we also have Mr. Brem on the stock footage discussing this on November 22nd. The Commission never called Brem. Brem describes himself as probably the closest witness, the closest spectator to the assassination, and yet after he told the police what he saw, and after he told the FBI what he saw, he was never called as a witness.
In reference to this evidence, which has not been secured by the Commission, and you indicated that Dr. Hume, isn't it?
Dr. Humes is the commander in the medical corps who conducted the autopsy. Yes.
Yes, that he stated to the Commission that he anticipated that perhaps they were not able to secure the X-rays, the photographs, etc., and therefore he had had an artist's conception made for their purposes. This assumption strikes one as being rather unusual, considering that the Commission, in its charge and in the authority presented to it by President Johnson in the creation of the Commission, led one to believe that they would have access to all materials, despite whatever their agency source, whether they were independent persons who happened to be there taking photographs, that they could subpoena this material, and that all governmental agencies, FBI, Secret Service, etc., would be required to hand over any materials to them that they desired. Was this material that they did not have, these photographs and X-rays, withheld from them, or had they simply not requested them?
Well, we could only know the answer to that question if we read the minutes of the Commission's meetings. However, the minutes of the Commission meetings have been sealed and have been placed in the National Archives, where they may not be seen until November 22nd, year 2038. So we can't get the answer to that question. In fact, I'll tell you what is in the archives, what's there at the present time. The testimony of all of the witnesses, the actual transcript is in the archives, and that too is sealed until the year 2038. The Commission did publish its version of what the witnesses said, but the Commission deleted portions of what the witnesses said, and in Volume 1 of the evidence published by the Commission appears the statement that the Commission reserved the right to edit the verbatim transcript in order to improve the clarity and the accuracy of the witness's testimony. Close quote. Now, I don't know what that means. I've never heard of changing the verbatim transcript to improve the accuracy. And perhaps if a witness said, I thought the shots came from the wooden fence, and the Commission knew, of course, that the shots came from the book depository building, they could strike out one phrase and put in another. But Other than that, I can't understand their comment. In addition to this, as I've indicated, all of the minutes of the Commission meetings are sealed. In addition to that, the Commission published a list, which is presently in the archives and can be seen. It's an index of the 1,555 files, which are called on the index sheet, list of basic materials relied upon by the Commission. 580 of those files are presently classified and cannot be seen. In addition to this, none of the actual evidence in the case, the bullet, the rifle, the pistol, the clothing allegedly worn by Oswald, the jacket, that is, the clothing worn by the President, none of the physical evidence is in the archives at all. None of it's been placed there. It's presently being held by the CIA, by the Secret Service, and by the FBI, and it too is inaccessible. No one is allowed to examine the evidence. Now, what I don't understand is if the Commission is so certain of its conclusion, and so certain that Oswald did it and did it alone, and that all of the evidence proves this conclusively, why the mystery? Why hide until after our lifetime, which was the phrase used by the Chief Justice at the beginning of the hearings when he predicted that this would take place? Why hide all of this material? It seems to me to be the very antithesis of democracy. It seems to be that most odious concept of the imposition of consensus from above.
Have you had occasion to direct these questions to members of the Commission itself, perhaps to some of its counsel, like Mr. Rankin?
Well, we have completed a film on the assassination. We've invited Mr. Rankin and every other attorney for the Commission and every member of the Commission to view the film, and then we agreed to film a 10-minute statement by each member of the Commission or each counsel for the Commission, and whatever they said would be presented in our film entirely unedited. Thus far, not one member of the Commission has agreed to make a statement for the record. The Commission, of course, doesn't exist anymore. When it completed its report, the Chief Justice handed the report to the President of the United States, and President Johnson looked around. He was on network television, held the document in his hand, and said, "It's very heavy," which was perhaps a fine and astute assessment of the document and one of the finest short analysis of the Warren report. But at that moment, the Commission, I think, made its wisest decision. It then disbanded and has never been available to answer any questions since that time.
And it has left no permanent staff or temporary staff in terms of secretarial or executive secretary? Or
No, it just disappeared when it handed the report to the
Who maintains
President's
its files? Its files are all maintained in the archives?
in the archives, and most of it is the personal files, that is, the minutes of the meetings, etc., are in secrecy there. The rest of them, some of them can be seen. They're remarkable files. The Commission, it seems, spent so much time investigating its critics that it just did not have an opportunity to look thoroughly into the facts. Of the 1,555 documents, which are the basic source materials, the Commission's own phrase, 35 of them deal with me. The agents of the FBI and Secret Service followed me around the country, tape recording my speeches at various universities, at various churches, and sending in reports as to what I had said, with the complaint often that this varies not at all from what Lane testified to before the Commission. He added nothing at all. Well, I'm sorry to have been so dull, but I could have told the members of the FBI and the Secret Service, in fact I often did at the lectures, that I was merely going to repeat that same old jury speech which I had made so many times before. But I practically escaped scrutiny if you compare my experience with that of Joachim Justin. Mr. Justin is a German-born, American naturalized citizen now, who wrote a very early book on the case called Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy. And one of the basic documents relied upon by the Commission is a file secured from the Gestapo, published in November 1937, secured from the Gestapo by the CIA, dealing no doubt with Mr. Joachim Justin's background, political reliability, and so that the Commission could peruse it to determine what kind of a gentleman, I suppose, Mr. Justin is. And the concept, the idea of Earl Warren poring over a Gestapo file in order to secure information about a commission critic is frankly something which sends chills going up and down my spine.
One of the major discussions running throughout your book is, of course, the discussion of the evidence, its unavailability to the Commission and to independent analysts such as yourself. Related to this is your relation of a number of incidences in which testimony apparently has been altered, where FBI agents have either through, well, let's say in the most charitable light, have misunderstood statements given by witnesses and have misquoted them in their reports to the Commission.
Yes, that was very charitable. The fact is that the majority of the witnesses who testified before the Commission, who were asked to comment upon FBI reports, which had been prepared by FBI agents who questioned the witnesses, in the majority of cases where the witness was confronted with the statement, he said the statement was inaccurate. And in almost every single instance where the statement was inaccurate, it fell into a pattern. That is, if, as the FBI presented the statement, if that were in fact true, it would be an indication of Oswald's guilt. But as the witness himself presented it, it was an indication of Oswald's innocence. And it may be that these were just misunderstandings. The FBI has a very strange fashion of conducting interviews. They don't use tape recording devices when they question witnesses, and they don't take notes. They leave the room and then sometime thereafter recapitulate what it is they think the witness said. And maybe most of these were errors, although there were errors which indicated, as I indicated earlier, a pattern, unfortunately, of prejudice and bias on the part of the agents. But at least in one instance, there is no question but that it was not a question of mere bias and prejudice subconsciously influencing a report. Nelson Delgado was with Lee Harvey Oswald in the Marine Corps. Mr. Delgado, a sergeant, is now, in fact, in Vietnam. We conducted a filmed interview with him just a week before he was sent to Vietnam. And he told us that which he testified to before the Commission as well. And that is that when he served with Oswald in the Marine Corps, Oswald was a very poor rifle shot. He said, you see, very often you would see Maggie's draws on the line. That is, when one fires
misses
in the Army.
The target
yes,
completely.
Complete
A flag
miss.
is,
right. Someone waves a red flag, and he said, you don't see that very often, not in the Marine Corps you don't. And Oswald was sort of the butt of the company because he was such a poor shot. He also said Oswald never cared about rifles, and his rifle was always dirty. And he said he was a very good friend of Oswald, as a matter of fact. He liked Oswald, but the fact is he just never cared about weapons, and he was a poor shot. He said 2 agents of the FBI came to question him. He said, when I told them that, they didn't like it, and they tried to get me to change my story. They badgered me, they argued with me, they told me it wasn't so, etc. And then they brought other agents in. There were a total of 4 agents, and he said this process was repeated continually. And he told this to the Commission. Of course, the Commission never called in the FBI agents and asked them if they had done this. But the unfortunate thing is that while Mr. Delgado was one of those people who had the backbone to stand up to the FBI and not allow his testimony to be influenced by their desires, and in fact the backbone to report to the Commission this unusual activity by the agents, which amounts, if he is correct, to subornation of perjury. It's a very serious crime if he's accurate about what the FBI agents were doing. The fact is that the FBI conducted 25,000 interviews and re-interviews. And this is the bedrock of the Commission's investigation, for the Commission conducted no investigation. It relied almost entirely upon the FBI, the Secret Service, the Dallas Police, and the Dallas Sheriff's Office, Sheriff's Department for its evidence. And it called but a very, very small minority of those who gave statements to the FBI.
Then also you report in your book allegations that witnesses who appeared in person before the Commission were frequently subjected to, or at least offered, a number of leading questions which would have directed their testimony along the lines that Commission investigation seemed to be proceeding, in your view, towards that of finding Oswald to be the only and sole assassin.
Yes, in most cases, the witnesses before they testified were prepared by counsel, that is, before the stenographer began to take minutes, the attorney rehearsed the testimony with the witness. Now, this is certainly a procedure which is excusable where there is an adversary procedure and where you want to prepare your witness knowing that he's going to be subjected to hostile cross-examination and the truth will come out in the crucible of cross-examination. But, of course, there was no cross-examination here before the commission. It just was not done that way. Secondly, it makes some sense if you want to see to it that hearsay evidence or relevant information is proscribed and only relevant matter comes in. You can have a rehearsal in advance, but since the record was so chock-filled with irrelevant material and repetitious material, this clearly was not the purpose of the preparation. But I think worse than this was the fact that the commission neglected to call the most important witnesses to the murder of Officer Tippit. It neglected to call the most important witnesses to the murder of President Kennedy. And when witnesses did come before the commission, if they were about to offer non-conforming testimony, they were stopped. I'll give you an example of Lee J. Bowers, who on November 22nd was in the railroad tower behind the wooden fence. With the exception of the men on the overpass, he commanded by far the best view of the area behind the fence. And he said, you know, this is his testimony, when the shots were fired, something directed my attention to that wooden fence. Something that, dash. And the dash indicates that he was in the middle of the sentence. I'm now quoting from his testimony. And the commission attorney broke in with a totally unrelated question and shortly thereafter excused Mr. Bowers without ever finding out what it was that attracted his attention to the wooden fence. Well, I met Mr. Bowers perhaps a year and a half after I read his testimony. We conducted a filmed interview with him, and I read this portion of his testimony. He said, it appeared to me that you were interrupted. He said, yes, I was interrupted by the commission lawyer. He did not want to hear me say what it is I saw, but I would have told him, if he would have listened, that I saw a puff of smoke or a flash of light at that wooden fence, and that's what attracted my attention. That statement is an extremely valuable one. It's one which the commission never troubled to take, and it is now even more valuable than it had been at the time because just last week Mr. Bowers was killed just a few miles from Dallas.
In addition to misstatements on the FBI reports and on leading questions and argumentation on the part of the commission attorneys, there also seems to have been some amount of tampering with witnesses or some evidence pointing to that on the part of the Secret Service and its holding of Marina Oswald.
Yes,
You
Marina.
comment on this in your book, that she was held for a long period of time and that her story seems to change as her stay with the Secret Service matures.
Yes, I would say that that's a very fair summation of what took place. On November 22nd, she said she was certain her husband was innocent, that he had never shot at anyone. He liked President Kennedy. She did not believe for an instant that he would shoot at the president. She was shown a rifle on November 22nd by the Dallas police, and she stated at that time she certainly could not state that that weapon ever belonged to Lee Harvey Oswald. She was held in protective custody, which was the phrase used by the government, although she did not request the custody. In fact, from November 22nd through November 29th, there was no Warren Commission, so the federal government had absolutely no authority whatsoever to move into the case, and they illegally held her with her mother-in-law, Marguerite Oswald, who later was released, but Marina Oswald was kept in custody until her testimony completed many, many months later. During that entire time, she was questioned daily by the FBI and by the Secret Service. And she said at first, when she testified before the commission, that the FBI practically wanted me to become an agent of theirs. They told me if I wanted to live in this country, if I did not want to be deported, I would have to cooperate with them. And she is quite bitter in her original testimony about the pressure brought upon her by the agents of the FBI. Her last statement regarding the rifle was on November 22nd, before her testimony, stating that the rifle, she could not identify it as Oswald's weapon. She testified then, in February of '64. After her first day of testimony, the Chief Justice came downstairs and met with the press and held an impromptu press conference in the lobby of the Veteran of Foreign Wars building. And the press asked him if Marina identified the weapon as one belonging to her husband. And the Chief Justice said, quote, "We haven't shown her the rifle yet. We're going to show it to her tomorrow, and I am pretty sure she is going to identify it as her husband's rifle." Close quote. Well,
Did she?
and she did, yes. His prediction was borne out. It was accurate, as was his position that the evidence might not be known to us during our lifetime. So the Chief Justice's score as a prognosticator was remarkably good, but I think his record as a fair investigator suffered with each of his accurate predictions.
And there have been constant stories, current, and many of them recorded in your book, of intimidation of witnesses from often anonymous sources, where people were told that they would be best advised through late-night phone calls, or strangers who came to their homes or places of business, where people were told that their own interests would be best served by keeping certain of their observations and opinions to themselves.
Yes, and one could say that in a number of these cases it may have been cranks who read in the newspaper that the person was about to testify, although even that, it seems to me, is a serious problem, because the integrity of an investigation depends upon the ability of the witness to give testimony freely without fear of being punished by anyone, officially or unofficially. But some of the matters are even more serious than that. In at least two cases where the witness was invited to testify and received a letter from the commission, the witness never told anyone about the invitation, and then received threatening phone calls and was warned not to testify, when it seems that no one other than commission counsel and commission personnel and the witness knew that the witness had been invited to testify. In addition to this...
Would you be able to document a couple of instances?
Sure. For example, Nancy Perrin-Rich, who was Ruby's barmaid, testified that she received an invitation to testify before the commission. Of course, she had already given a statement to the FBI, but it was not published anywhere, and no one had access to this publicly. She was invited to testify by the commission, and then she said she received phone calls, she was threatened, a man followed her in a car, and she was told it would be best not to testify. Another would be Mrs. Wilma Tice, who in fact was the woman who testified that she saw Jack Ruby at the Parkland Hospital. That was very inconvenient for the commission, for the commission said that Ruby was not at the Parkland Hospital. And in the middle of the night, her door was barricaded from the outside, the front door, the back door. The bells began to ring at her house. Then the telephone rang, and she was told by an anonymous person, whose voice she did not recognize, "You'd better keep your mouth shut, you'd better not testify." Now, these two instances are particularly puzzling because the public in general did not know that these two women were going to appear before the commission. Of course, there were even more serious threats to the integrity of the investigation and the witness's right to testify freely. In the instance of Warren Reynolds, for example. Mr. Reynolds is a man who worked at a used car lot just 1.5 blocks from where Officer Tippett was killed on November 22nd, early in the afternoon. He heard some shots. He came outside of the store and saw a man fleeing, running right past his used car lot. The man had a pistol in his hand. Well, there's no proof that that man had just fired at Officer Tippett, but he came from the scene. He was carrying a pistol, and he was running from the scene, and I think one can say that he may have been involved, certainly, in the Tippett killing. Reynolds chased him, then lost him. Reynolds was on television that day describing what he had seen. He described the man who fled from the scene as a man who was short and on the heavy side. Oswald, of course, was of medium height or a little taller and was extremely thin. He was not describing Lee Harvey Oswald. He was never questioned, Mr. Reynolds, by any agent of the federal government during November or December or until January 21st of 1964. And then 2 FBI agents called upon him, showed him pictures of Oswald, and he said that was not the man who he saw flee from the Tippett scene. 2 days later, Warren Reynolds was shot through the head. Bullet entered his right temple and lodged in the lower portion of his left jaw. He was rushed to the hospital. The Dallas police arrested a man and charged him with the attempted murder of Reynolds. Reynolds, fortunately, recovered. This man was charged with the attempted murder, but he was released. He was rearrested. When there was more evidence, he had called up his sister and told her that he did in fact shoot at Reynolds. He told other people that it was good that Reynolds was shot at, etc. Finally, though, he was released because he was able to present an alibi witness. Betty Mooney McDonald was his alibi witness. She came forward and said, yes, this man did not shoot Reynolds. He was with me at the time. Based upon that statement, and even before Reynolds had sufficiently recovered so that he could identify the man who shot him, or not identify him, the charges were dropped against the man. Now Miss McDonald, the alibi witness, became somewhat expendable, evidently. She was arrested 2 days later by the Dallas police for quarreling with her roommate, although her roommate was not arrested, taken to the Dallas police station, where within 1 hour she was found dead. The Dallas police said that she hung herself to death. She was incidentally a stripper for Jack Ruby.
There seem to have been a large number of people who met untimely ends, who were involved in one way or another with the aftermath of the president's assassination. I recall that there were several, I think 3 or 4 newsmen who died in automobile accidents or under more mysterious circumstances, any number of witnesses who were shot and assailants not located, or at least never brought to trial, people who committed or allegedly committed suicide, and apparently persons who attempted to you relate one incident that I recall reading about, a person who attempted to secure a photograph of a potential witness and complained that it was a very dangerous assignment, and stopped attempting to secure this photograph before he had achieved it. Did you or any of the people associated with you in your independent investigation ever have any occasion to fear for your own safety? Were you threatened?
Well, we haven't lost an amateur investigator yet, fortunately. But the fact is that there has been a great deal of violence involving witnesses and some investigators. There were 2 reporters who visited Jack Ruby's apartment, and they visited that apartment November 24th, just after Ruby killed Oswald. I have no idea what they found there. One was Jim Cote of the Dallas Times-Herald. He was killed in his apartment in Dallas with a karate chop to the throat, and nothing was stolen from his apartment. That's an unsolved crime. The other reporter who was there returned to his local assignment desk outside of Dallas, and he was shot to death in the police station of his own local community by the son of the chief of the police force. Now, it may be that all of these events are completely unrelated, although there is one investigator on the scene in Dallas, Penn Jones, who is the editor of the Midlothian Mirror in Midlothian, Texas, which is about 23 miles from Dallas, and he's a very active investigator. And he said there are many more deaths than I knew about. He said he would like very much to see a computer faced with the task of trying to explain the deaths of so many people so closely related to the facts in this case. And I suppose that would be an interesting thing to feed into a computer. But whether these deaths really resulted from the fact that the witnesses saw things on November 22nd or November 24th, or were familiar with certain facts which might prove inconvenient, or whether they were not, the fact is that this unexplained violence, these unsolved crimes, tended to induce conforming testimony. When we were in Dallas, we questioned a number of witnesses, and a number of them refused to give us statements. They were very friendly to us. They said they'd like to help us. They said they did not believe the Warren report. It's an interesting thing, I think. There are less people proportionally in Dallas, Texas, who believe the Warren report than any place else in the United States. Almost none of the witnesses with whom we spoke, in fact, they say this in the film, we show them the report, and they say, look, I know what I saw, and I know what the commission said I saw. I know they distorted what I said, and I know that the report is inaccurate in that respect, and I don't understand why people throughout the country are so naive as to accept it. Witness after witness in Dallas said this to us. But many also said, I'd like to make a statement, but frankly, with the reporters being killed and Reynolds being shot, etc., I'm just afraid. Now, whether there was a relationship or not, the fact that the Commission showed no interest in seeing that these crimes were solved or explained in some way increased the terror and increased the conformity of the testimony as well. As far as my own experience with the police, we did find Domingo Benavides, who was an eyewitness to the Tippit killing. He told me the man who did it was short and was heavy and that it was in fact not Oswald. And we asked him if he would agree to do a filmed interview with us, and he agreed to do that at the motel that we were staying at the following morning. But that evening, instead, 2 Dallas homicide investigators called upon us, indicated they were beginning an investigation of us. They understood that we had seen Mr. Benavides and made it quite plain to us that Benavides would not show up, and Benavides did not show up. And investigators for us who've gone into the area where Officer Tippit was killed in Oak Cliff often are followed by police who hamper them in their activities because it's difficult with a police officer following you to carry out a task which involves some investigation.
Well, Mr. Lane, your book and your statements here today, in effect, as they bear on the treatment and the handling of evidence in this investigation of the murder of President Kennedy, allege that there have been misstatements on FBI reports, either through incompetence or through design, that there were leading questions and argumentation, in some places perhaps outright obfuscation on the part of commission attorneys conducting interviews, that there has been evidence of tampering of witnesses on the part of federal and local police agencies, that there has been intimidation from various sources of prospective witnesses, and finally that much material evidence has been impounded in the National Archives or as yet has not been located. What, in effect, do you feel is required in order to resolve the questions that remain and which you and others have repeatedly raised about this set of murders of the President and of Officer Tippit and of Lee Harvey Oswald? What do you see as being a possibility on the part either of the government or on the part of some independent group to determine some of the facts of this case and to resolve some of the contradictions that seem to remain?
I think that what is required at this time is a great national dialogue. I think that it is certain that the American people must indicate quite plainly that they are not satisfied with the Warren report, that they feel that the answers have not yet been given, and that we are entitled to answers to such questions as who killed President Kennedy and why was he killed. I think that when that dialogue begins, and I think that it is now beginning in America for the first time, it's a dialogue which has taken place in Western European countries for more than 2 years now, but I think it is just now beginning in America. And I think that what is required from that dialogue, the result must be a demand that the Congress enact legislation forcing the National Archives to open up their classified information, to let those of us who live in this democracy find out what evidence the government has gathered and has suppressed regarding the death of the President. Of course, President Johnson has the power to open the archives, but he is the person who's closed the archives, so I think one can hardly expect that he will reverse his position at this time unless there is a great feeling in the country that it must be done.
And are there at present any attempts to form an independent review of some stature separate from the government among perhaps groups of lawyers or the Bar Association or some legal body?
I don't think that anything specific has been done along those lines at this point. I think that probably will have to follow, not precede, the dialogue which I think is just beginning to come. But I am hopeful that in the months ahead there will be such a demand and there will be such an inquiry.
I want to thank you very much for being here today with us, Mr. Lane, and for giving us this interview on your book, Rush to Judgment. I'd like to point out that the Commission set itself the following goals when it first initiated its efforts. It broke down the area of assignments for its staff, for its attorneys and their assistants, into the following 6 areas. 1. Oswald's activities on November 22. 2. Oswald's background. 3. Oswald's career in the Marine Corps and his stay in the Soviet Union. 4. Oswald's murder in the Dallas police station. 5. Jack Ruby's background. 6. The procedures employed to protect President Kennedy. The national dialogue, which now appears to be developing in the form of Mr. Lane's book and in other books that are being published on the subject, seems to be centering around, were these adequate categories of investigation and thought? And even within those categories, were they adequately investigated and resolved? This has been Frank Millspaugh at WBAI FM.